Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and today I'd like to show you how to use this 2-inch circle ruler. This is a super cool ruler for stitching scallops or perfectly spaced 2-inch circles into squares or in sashing, wherever you'd like to put it. So let's start out by learning how to stitch scallops, and I want these scallops to come downward through this block. And here's the thing, a lot of circle templates have this shape, and as you can see when you're starting out, that's going to be impossible off the edge of your quilt. So that's why I designed this ruler with two different versions of the same circle. You can do the outer, meaning that you're pulling the long arm and the ruler foot or your home sewing machine, you're going along the outer shape. And then this side is going through the inner, you're pushing inside. And it's going to be really interesting to play with this, and you'll find that one ruler often will feel different, I don't know, it'll just kind of feel more natural to you than the other. So this is the best way to get started when you're working right off the edge of a quilt, just like so. Now I'm going to be bouncing from pocket to pocket, so you can see this is designed, cut out, specifically to fit that ruler foot, which is a 1/2 inch round foot with the needle right in the center. And so here in this case, I am pulling the machine and making sure that that ruler stays in nice contact with the edge of that ruler. So I'm making sure those stay in alignment. Now I've got a side clamp here. I'm going to just temporarily take off for right now and release that so that way I can stitch right to the edge of my quilt. So here we go, and now I've got this line of echo ditching. I basically want to stop here and then we'll space out for the next row. But you see I've got these etched lines on the ruler that are helping me keep this nice and straight. Even though this block has gone just a little bit wonky, it's still going to be a-okay. Alrighty. So there we go, I stitched right to that. Now something to keep in mind and pay attention to is where the center line is coming down. And I leave my ruler in the exact same position where it's been, and I'm just going to mark that. And this is just going to help us space out our next row, because as you can see, this particular square isn't perfect. It's not a multiple of 2 or 1, so it's not going to go exactly evenly. So how do I work with that? Basically, I'm going to go on ahead and stitch up just a bit, and I'm going to, it is a little bit of guesstimation, to be honest guys, because what I've got to do basically is kind of guesstimate. I want my needle to end in that exact spot right there. That's where I should be going. So if I line up that straight line going through there and the straight line coming up through the middle of that pocket, and line all of that up, and then also keep in mind the 1/4 inch that you're getting. The needle's in the center position, so the foot's going to slot in here and you're going to be a 1/4 inch up from that edge, and that looks exactly right. So what I'm going to do is stitch up a few more stitches, connect with the edge of that ruler, and then straight back down, just like so. So it's not that complicated, but basically what I did was I was just stitching that little bit of a sliver of a circle right there. An alternative, if that's too complicated for you, is just to simply travel stitch along the top edge of the circle that I was on and get to that mark that I made. So here we go. Now we're ready for our second row. Got nicely spaced out. You want to make sure that you are straight, meaning that this straight line here is lined up so that it's going to run right across the top of the circle that you're stitching to. So here we go. Now it's going to shift, like I'm right here on the edge. Yeah, I'm right here on the edge, and as you can see, I'm getting some side-to-side shift. Let me get my clamp back in place, even though I know I'll have to take it off a little bit later. Let me get this back in place. I know I used to not use these at all, but now I'm kind of a clamping nut. I just really think that this is helpful for keeping the quilt straight and square. And I learned so much about quilting from Janet George. I will link up her YouTube channel, and she does lots of videos on QCT. So I've been learning so much from QCT and that process, and I picked up all of these tips about keeping the quilt square from Janet. Okay, so here we go, back on track. I'm lining this up. I've got my foot in that pocket. I'm lining up over here. I've got straight lines. I'm kind of just eyeballing where that straight line that's etched on the back of the ruler is coming in, and this straight line is coming in because I want to land right there. All right, now I'm going to click on, and I'm pulling the long arm and the foot towards me, right against that ruler. You know, a ruler foot is a style of free motion foot. So whether you're on a long arm or you're on a home sewing machine, you can start wiggling off in all different directions, you know. You can be wild and crazy with it. So keep that in mind. You've got to kind of keep it under control. All right, so right here, because I started right in that corner, I can use this line right here to line up as my center point. I've also got a little bit of a curve right here. I can line up with that curve from before. So super useful. There's all kinds of different little etched lines on the ruler, and I do that intentionally so you have more than enough to line up with your scallops and get things really nicely placed. So you can already see this is starting to come together, looking really good. Now let's do our next row, and I'm going to continue doing it with this particular side. And as you see, where we started, that started with a perfect half circle. So then this dead ended with that perfect quarter circle. And so now we should be right back to our first set, and this is a perfect half circle. So here we go, lining this up nicely. Click the machine on and swing around and down. Very good. Now, I just bop it over. It's just a real quick shift over. Don't even have to think about it. Make sure it's lined up nicely. And I do have some marked lines within this block that does not have anything to do with the circle ruler. That has everything to do with a feather ruler that I shared in another video. So if you're curious about stitching feathers with rulers, definitely check out that video. All right, let's see if I've got just a little bit of space here where I can do this without having to take my side clamp off, because I really think I'm just getting a little bit of distortion through here. A lot of it has to do with my wiggly wobbly batting. There we go. That looks good. And yet again, just to very nicely explain this, I am placing a mark here where this straight line on the ruler, there's an etched line. If you can't see it, there's an etched line right through the center of that circle. That's indicating the center of the 2-inch circle that you're stitching. So if I mark that right there, then I know that that is where I want my little V to happen. And what do I mean by that little V? That little V, it comes down, it hits, and then it changes direction for your next scallop. So that's where that's supposed to be. So now let's switch over to this. I don't think actually that will work. Yeah, this is not going to work. Well, it might. Actually, let me take that back. I'm going to stitch down a bit. So what you have to do is you're in that position, but you know that's not the right position for you to get started on. You need to move your foot up. You need to stitch further forward, and then, because it's in your way, and then you can get your ruler in the right position. Okay, so I'm lining this up, and what am I lining up with? Well, I've got straight lines through here, and this straight line running right through the middle can be lined up with the V of the row before. I can make sure that straight line's going through and it's running across the top of that circle all the way through, and then I've got another straight line here that can be lined up with that V too. So all that's lined up real nice. Now I'm going to stitch down a bit, and so this is just simple travel stitching. If you want to, grab the ditcher ruler just to help you do that little bit of stitching, and it is just a little bit of a circle shape, but it's really nice to get that lined up nicely. Okay, and now this is it's a different feel, and this will be really interesting to see which one you like better, because in this case I'm pressing kind of more towards the back. I'm putting my hand pressure back here, and I'm pulling the machine, I'm kind of pushing away from myself on the handlebar as I make that movement. So it's just a different feel. But I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to just stitch a half circle shape and then reposition, half circle shape and reposition. But this one you can see I'm going to come through and I will be able to end right there. So that's really useful. Let's see if this is going to work. So here we go, nesting into that pocket. Now for some reason that's not lining up just exactly as I would like it to, but I think if I get over there, you can just nudge it ever so slightly and then it works out just fine. Okay, so now I'll reposition. I'm going to go back to the other one. I find that when you get started and you kind of have a baseline on one side, you really want to stick with that side as you continue quilting. they're the same shape. They really, really are. But I find with scallops in particular, they're a little tricky, finicky, and you want them to stack up exactly right, perfectly, as they are right now. This is looking so good. I love this. And it just helps to stick with the same shape that you've got going on. Okay, it looks like we're going to have a partial row here at the end. And kind of shift over on my little clamp here. That's looking okay. Make sure it's not gonna go anywhere crazy. So I'm gonna stitch this last one, and then this is the tricky part about scallops. It never fits perfectly into any shape. I don't care how excellent it is. So I'm marking again my little mark from the center point of that. And then I want to go in ahead and just mark through the center point of all of them. So let me slide this out. And it's just a simple measure. So I can just line this up so I have the center mark running through that one, just like so. And then that's also going to give me spacing so I know where the center mark on that one is going to go to. It's just nice to just take a minute and put a few marks on your quilt like this. It's going to save you a lot of time. It's going to make it so much easier to stitch. It's going to give us also something to line up with, because we know, okay, we need to put a V there, a V there, and a V there. Actually, that we didn't need a mark on that V. So what we'll have basically is just a little bit of stitching coming in, connecting, then travel stitch down, then a little bit of stitching coming down and connecting, and then travel stitch down. And that, while it doesn't look like much, and it isn't actually that much stitching, that is what is the key to having this be consistent and having it fill the block completely so it looks really nice. Okay, so here's the tricky spot. I cannot actually stitch down far enough because of my echo ditching, so instead of stitching down, I'm stitching over a little bit. Again, the reason is you got to get your foot out of the way so that way you can get your ruler in the right position. So a little bit, this is just guesstimation. If you stitch down farther than you need, it's not a big deal, just stitch back. All right, so I'm lining this up where I've got my mark that I made that's right down the center of the scallop in the row before. I've got my straight line lined up. That looks good. All right, so I'm going to click on, I'm going to back up one stitch, come down, and form my V. There we go. That's it. I know it seems really silly, but that is literally it. It's not a big deal. All right, now I'm going to travel stitch all the way down. I'm kind of estimating about the same distance. So about right there is where I think I'm going to be. So let's do that again, lining up my ruler, about right there, lining up my straight lines. That's looking good. Click on the machine, stitch down, connect, and stitch out. There we go. Now, if you don't have the ditcher ruler, you can just use the edge of the circle ruler. If that's already in your hand, go on ahead and use it. And you're just using that as a guide to help you carefully travel stitch down, and then again line up the ruler one more time. Now if you way out here I don't have anything to line up with, so I'm going to position it this way so I have stuff to line up with on this side. That looks good. Looks like I overstitched just a bit, but that's again not a big deal. I can just take a stitch back, connect with that ruler, stitch in, hit that scallop, stitch back out. There we go. So as you can see, these little extra details are not very much, especially that little side stitching. Not a lot of stitching, but it definitely makes the overall effect of the scallops just look amazing on your quilt. So now let's use our 2-inch circle ruler to stitch circles into 2-inch squares. And you can also use this technique to stitch into 2-inch sashing. Really it can do so many different things. So I'm eyeballing down the halfway point of the square. You could also take a ruler and mark it. And I'm just pulling up thread right here in the ditch. I'm going to take a couple stitches in place just to lock my thread tails together. And then now I'm going to place my 2-inch circled ruler, and I'm lining up. There's etch lines on the ruler here that form the square around it. So I'm just placing those two corners basically right in line with the corners of my square. Okay, and it looks like I need to stitch down just a bit and then up and around. Super slow, super careful. And this is one situation where you definitely don't want the ruler to slip. You want to be really mindful of that. You know, any movement is basically going to result in the circle not fitting the square exactly. Now, you could shift the ruler around and go like this if you only need to stitch one circle. That's certainly open to you, but I need to stitch multiple circles, so I'm going to go on ahead and move the ruler to be like this. And actually, no, that's the opposite of what I was doing before. There we go. And again, I'm making sure that those corners are nicely aligned. So basically, this is kind of a bouncy circle. So I'm bouncing out. I'm making sure that I'm going to hit or skim that ditch. And then I'm making sure that I'm hitting the ditch on the opposite side. And I played around with this quite a bit. I really feel like this is the best way to stitch circles, you know, in a 9-patch like what we're doing right here. And I think this is the best bet because it can just get really slow and persnickety if you go one circle at a time. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to come back the other way, and this would be an opportunity if you know, things were awkward, maybe you were really close to the edge of the quilt, then you could switch to this side of the ruler. That would be certainly open to you. I'm going to stick with the same side of the ruler. As I said, sometimes things don't match up. If you switch sides, maybe it's just simply being used to one side or the other. Now this is where it's really easy to get off. You've got the edge lines of the circle, you've also got these corners. I think it's better to line up the corners, those straight lines, with the straight lines of your quilt, because you're at an angle. You know, this is a couple inches away from my face right here, so you're at a little bit of an angle, and that can alter your perception of those edged lines. Now, as you can see, that didn't come down quite as far as it should. So let's see if we can fix that with the next one. So what do we have to do to get that to come down just a little bit further? So that looks good. I've got it lined up nicely, but you know, it's a really squishy batting, and that can make a difference. Looks like this one's, yep, that one's better. So it's all about ruler placement and playing with that. Just like the ditcher ruler, you know, you might be dead set, you know, I have my circle etched on the line, but I'm looking at this, you know, at an angle here. If I really put my face on top of it, I see it needs to nudge back just a little bit. All right, let's try that again. Stitching forward. Again, a little bit of a gap, but not a deal breaker. I would rather my circle end up within the square, and rather than going out of it and stitching beyond the ditch. So I really like that. I think that looks great. Okay, to get to the next row of circles, I'm going to grab my ditcher ruler again, lining up, straight line through that pocket with the ditch, so that way I can stitch nice and perfectly right in that ditch all the way down. And again, I'm eyeballing where that center point will be, somewhere in the middle of that square. There we go. Well, let's try it the other way. We're going to try it with this side and see if I'm just a little bit more accurate this time. This time, I can tell you, it will be easier to veer outward because you're pushing the ruler against the outer edge of you're pushing the ruler foot against the outer edge of the ruler. And if it slips, you're going to err on the side of stitching beyond the block. See here? I just went beyond the block. Just a bit. And I went a bit beyond the block on that side too. So again, let's see if we can correct for that. So this time I'm going to bring the ruler in ever so slightly. Press firmly. Stitch around. Still a little bit getting out of the edges. But you know, that's the thing. You kind of have to just pay attention to what's going on. This time I'm going to nudge it just a little bit further inward that way. I think that looks good. And really make sure that those straight edge lines are lined up with the ditches. That's going to ensure you're going to end up in the ditch exactly right. All right. Stitch down and around. Looks like this time it was perfect. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. So it's just a matter of getting to know it. Figuring out how you can adjust halfway through the circle so it doesn't end up coming out wonky. Now for this angle, I've got those corners again. I can line up those corners with the corners of the square I'm stitching in, and I can hook my thumb here along that curve, which is super useful. So I'm going to try that. coming close. Now I'm running a little on the small side. So I think I'd rather the circle be a little on the small side than on the too big side. I think that looks better. But let's try it again and see if we can just get it absolutely perfect. I think you guys have figured out by now, my goal is always with ruler quilting, if I want to stitch a shape, then I want to stitch that shape perfectly into that space. I think this is good so far. This time I'm going to nudge it down just a little bit more. Oh, that looks good. And you know, really when you think about it, you know, I'm quibbling about basically 2 threads distance. I mean, really, really tiny stuff. So you can get really persnickety with this, but understand that, you know, this is fabric. There is squishy batting in the middle, and things will shift and wiggle just a little bit, and you need to be ready for that. Okay, now I've built up to it, so let's go on ahead and do this. Let me show you how to do a complete circle, and so that way you can see how this compares. I just find it to be a little bit on the slower side. And then I do find that it also tends to be a little bit wigglier than when I do a line of them. So here we go. I'm going to do that half circle shape, coming up and around, a little bit outside. I'm a little bit running a little small. That's okay. Now I want to at least keep that consistent, let's say. So I'm going to swing around and down, and anything else, let's hope that it all ends up in the same spot. There we go. Okay, so another reason to chain your circles together is that it spits you out in kind of an awkward spot. So I'm over here and I need my next circle over here. So what's a girl to do, you know? So that is also another reason to chain your circles together. It definitely does make it more convenient when it comes to stitching more of them. Although I do need to stitch this block in the ditch anyway, so that's convenient too. But when you're doing a lot of circles, they are time-consuming. Circles are some of the most time-consuming designs there are. So just keep this in mind that, you know, doing one at a time is going to be slower. Doing multiple at a time in a row is going to be a little bit faster. Okay, you can also use the circle ruler to the side. So here I'm sliding in this way, and I'm checking out the side placement. This looks pretty good. Let's see how this goes. That's pretty perfect. Just skimming that ditch, coming right in the ditch on the other side like that. Now let's rotate around, get it back in that pocket. Checking out my corners, making sure those 2 straight lines are lining up just exactly right. All right, let's see if I get a wobble this time. No, this one looks pretty good. That's another thing, you know, it might also be the angle you're holding the ruler in. I mean, I kind of get stuck on holding it like this because that's the way I usually make scallops. But, you know, that just worked out a lot easier and more accurately. So maybe it would work better to hold it to the side. And again, this is such a tiny, tiny, tiny amount that I'm kind of obsessing about, and that's enough to make a difference. It definitely is. Let's try it with this side, and ooh, that's kind of cool. This lets you know that the foot might not be completely symmetrical because that fits tighter going in this direction than it does in this. Like that feels loose. This feels kind of tight. So that's interesting too. So it might not even be that my ruler is slipping. It might be, oh, this is interesting. It might be that the ruler foot itself is not perfectly circular, which would result in definitely that explanation of that little gap sometimes, but not all the time. Okay. I feel like I've just solved a major detective mystery. I think that's really interesting. And it's something that, you know, you can kind of go into it going, okay, it's not going to be 110% perfect because there's outside influences such as the size of your foot that can have an impact. And that time it was really, really far off, probably because I was distracted. But here is a great solution if you stitch circles and they're not exactly perfect and it's driving you crazy. I want you to go in there and fill it with a spiral. Now, here's 3 spirals you can use. This is a messy spiral. You're going to go all the way to the center, and then you're just going to wiggle off and go into the next one and you're going to stitch all the way into the center, and it's okay no matter how messy it is, and then you'll loop off again. See how cool that is? And automatically when you stitch through the middle of your spirals, you no longer see those little issues. Okay, here's another type of spiral. You go in, leaving yourself space to get back out, stitch right through the middle to get back out, and then wiggle to your next circle. So you can see how this kind of changed itself together really nicely. Now this time I'm going to stitch, that got a little on the dense side, that's okay. This time I'll think about it a little bit better. Leave myself space open there, just wiggle out, and over here. There we go. You're just focusing on leaving yourself enough space to get back out of the circle, and then space to go into the next one. Wiggle through there. Now I could break thread here, but I think I'll just make it nice and messy. I'll go right through the center and stitch this last one. So a little bit made up there, a few blips and blops, but ultimately I feel like, we figured out why I wasn't getting exactly perfectly consistent results, and it's because the foot is most definitely not perfectly circular. And that is really interesting. I mean, I think it's extremely close, but when we're doing something this persnickety, that can be one stitch or a couple threads distance of difference. So I personally found holding the ruler like this, vertical, definitely resulted in a more accurate stitched circle. So that's really, really interesting. Of course, more playing is definitely in order, but I hope that you will come and check out this new 2-inch circle ruler. You can find it at leahday.com/circle. You can also check out my new set of 3 shapes. We've got the ditcher ruler, the 2-inch feather, and the 2-inch circle. You can find them all together at leahday.com/shapes. They're in their own collection, so you can pick them all up at the same time for a great price. Until next time, let's go quilt.